Hi, I'm Kelly Chase, and this is History Detective, and today I want to introduce you to Mungo Man. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this video is being recorded today. I pay my respects to the elders and knowledge holders, past, present, and emerging. For a few hundred years, historians had a vague idea of how long they thought First Nations people had been living in Australia. Generally, they estimated a few thousand years. But then the discovery of one body changed the way that we thought about Australian history forever. That was the discovery of the body of Mungo Man. Lake Mungo is located in New South Wales, and according to Google Maps, it's about an 11-hour drive west from Sydney. In 1974, a geologist, Dr. Jim Bowler, discovered the bones of Mungo Man. This wasn't the first time that he had found bones in this area. In fact, 6 years before, he had found some bones protruding from a lunette, which is a kind of a sand dune that has hardened into clay. 1 year after finding the original bones, he decided to enlist the help of some professional archaeologists, and they excavated the bones and tested them to determine that they belonged to a female who had been cremated. The very fact that this was identified as a cremation was significant because it became the oldest known cremation in the world. So, in 1974, after some particularly heavy rainfall, our aforementioned geologist, Jim Bowler, was riding on his motorbike when he saw a part of a white skull poking out from the soil. He had found another skeleton, but this time it was male. How do we tell the difference between a male and a female skeleton? Well, the usual way that archaeologists tell is by the pelvis. You see, the female pelvis has to be wide enough to fit a baby's head through during childbirth. There are a few other factors, such as skull shape and height, that can be estimated from the length of the other bones, bone density, and finger length. Unfortunately, due to deterioration, the skull and the pelvis were not in great shape. After all, the skeleton was more than 40,000 years old, and archaeologists had to use other measurements, called postcranial measurements, to find out whether the skeleton was male or female. FYI, postcranial just means all of the bones other than the skull. Mungo Man clocked in at about 170 centimetres tall, or 5'6", and he was about 50 years old. Back to our motorbike riding 70s geologist. Now that the bones had been discovered, the question was what to do with them. This is where we get into some moral and ethical questions about what to do with human remains that are dug up in archaeological excavations, and this particular case creates a conundrum. The scientific carbon dating of these human remains was able to date Australian Aboriginal culture back more than 40,000 years at the time, and this was a hugely significant discovery for Australian history. At the time, there was some opposition by Aboriginals not wanting scientists to take the bones away from their resting place, and the bones were taken without the permission of the local elders. However, the discoveries from both Mungo Man and his distant relative, Mungo Lady, changed both the scientific and historical perspectives on the extent of First Nations culture in Australia. With this discovery, the door of Australian history was flung open to reveal one of the oldest continuing cultures on Earth. History was rewritten, and the academic field of ancient Australian Aboriginal history was kick-started. The only problem was that after studying the bones, they were kept in a storeroom at the university, much to the distress of the traditional owners of the land. On the one hand, science had opened up a window and allowed the First Nations Australian history to be recognised, but on the other hand, these human remains were not being treated respectfully. For a long time, archaeologists and anthropologists have had a very dark history of looting, and there are many stories of museums refusing to return stolen human remains and other artefacts to their rightful owners. This story does have a resolution. In 2017, Mungo Man's bones were returned to his descendants on his country in a ceremony. In other words, repatriated. But because of erosion, they were unable to be reburied. They are now kept safely back on country. However, these were just one set of human bones that have been repatriated. Mungo man's remains were discovered accidentally and have been able to go home, but there is a much darker side to the repatriation story. Many of the bones of the first peoples that are housed in museums, not generally on display, but in a storage room, are the spoils of a very gruesome and violent pastime of bone collecting and trade for the sake of anthropology. In order for early museums to acquire the bones, unscrupulous men would rob graves. Some doctors would take bones from mortuaries, prisons, hospitals, and asylums, wherever they could get their hands on human remains. I found a newspaper report on the Trove website from 1903 about Dr. Ramsay Smith, who was suspended from his job and went on trial for his shocking corpse-related crimes. The newspaper says, the accusations deal with the alleged mutilations of dead bodies and clandestine exhumations. I remember in my early travels to the UK, a travel guide was touting the eccentricities of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. They discussed the shrunken heads on display. I am ashamed to say that I didn't even think about the ethics of having human heads in a display case or the stories behind how these remains came to be on display. I didn't think about what might be hidden in the back rooms or who the remains might rightly belong to. But the positive news is, as of 2022, more than 1,660 Aboriginal ancestors have come home. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you would like to hear an original song on this topic, there's a song called These Old Bones, which I wrote for this episode, and you'll find a link in the show notes. Also, you'll find a link to my website where you'll find teaching resources and a reference list. This is Kelly Chase, on the case.